The Shadow's Bargain. Prologue, the price of perfection. There is an old saying in the city of Nocturne. A man may trade with his shadow, but the shadow always takes its due. No one knew when the tradition began. It was simply accepted, whispered in back alleys, and written in the margins of forgotten books. Your shadow was not just an absence of light, it was something alive. Something waiting. If you made the right offering, if you spoke the right words at midnight beneath a moonless sky, you could bargain with it. A gift in exchange for a wish. A talent in exchange for a price. But what happened after the bargain, that was never clear. And no one ever got something for free. This was something Vincent Delane would soon learn. The hard way. Chapter 1, The Musician and the Whispering Dark. Vincent had been a struggling musician for most of his life. His hands were quick, but never perfect. His compositions were heartfelt, but never genius. He was good, but not great, and in a city like Nocturne, where talent was currency, being good was the same as being invisible. No one remembered the mediocre. And Vincent was tired of being forgotten. It was at his lowest moment, his rent overdue, his pockets empty, his violin battered from years of desperate use, that he remembered the old legend. The Shadow's Bargain. He had nothing left to lose. So on the darkest night of the year, Vincent stood beneath the towering spires of Nocturne's oldest district, where the gaslights barely flickered, and the alleyways stretched into endless blackness. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and whispered the words he had read in an ancient book. A shadow follows, a shadow knows, a shadow waits where moonlight goes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, his shadow moved. Not with him. Not as a reflection of his body. It moved on its own. And then, it spoke. What would you trade, Vincent Delane? His breath hitched. The voice was low, silken, curling around his name like a slow-burning fire. He swallowed hard. He hesitated. I want to play like no one else has ever played before. A soft chuckle echoed from the darkness. And what will you give in return? Vincent exhaled shakily. Take whatever you want. His shadow smiled. And the deal was done. Chapter 2, The Devil's Talent. The next morning, Vincent woke to something impossible. His hands, his once clumsy, once imperfect hands, moved with inhuman precision. His fingers glided over his violin strings as if they had always belonged there. And when he played, the music was flawless. Not just beautiful. Not just masterful. It was impossible. The sound of his violin could make people weep, could bring strangers to their knees, could fill the emptiest hearts with longing. He was no longer just a musician. He was legendary. Within days, his name spread through Nocturne like wildfire. Invitations flooded in. Patrons begged for his performances. He played in grand halls, in noble courts, in front of audiences who had never cared for him before, and now could not live without him. Vincent had never known such power. But then, he began to notice it. His shadow was no longer following him. It was watching. Chapter 3, The Shadow That Walked Alone. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of his eye. A shape that did not quite match his movements. Then, one evening, as he played in a candlelit chamber, he saw something that froze him mid-note. His shadow, standing behind him. Not stretched along the floor. Not bound to his feet. Standing. Separate. Watching. And smiling. Chapter 4, The Unraveling. From that night on, Vincent could not ignore it. His shadow had begun to move when he wasn't looking. He would turn a corner and catch it lingering behind, a second too slow. He would lift a glass to his lips, and his shadow's hand would remain motionless. One night, he awoke in his chambers to find it standing at the foot of his bed. Staring. Not as a reflection. As something else. Stop this, he hissed. But his shadow only whispered, I am only taking what is mine. And it was right. because Vincent had never asked what his shadow had taken in return for his talent. And now, he was beginning to understand. Chapter 5: The Man Without a Soul. It started with small things. He forgot faces, the names of people he had once known. Then, he stopped dreaming. His mind became empty, his emotions numb. He played, but no longer felt joy. He ate, but no longer tasted flavor. His shadow had not taken his body. It had taken his humanity. Piece by piece. And soon, he would be nothing but a shadow himself. Chapter 6: The Final Bargain. Desperate, Vincent returned to the alley where he had made the deal. The darkness welcomed him. His shadow, now fully independent, stood waiting. "You cheated me," Vincent hissed. His shadow laughed. "I gave you what you wanted. And now, I take what is mine." Vincent's hands trembled. His perfect hands, the hands that had played for kings, that had held the world in their music. He looked at them, then at his shadow. And he made his final choice. "If you want what's left of me." His voice was hoarse. "Then take it. But give me something in return." His shadow tilted its head. "And what is that?" Vincent swallowed. "My soul, for my music." The shadow smiled. "Done." And with that, Vincent Delane ceased to be. Epilogue: The Shadow's Song. The next morning, the people of Nocturne awoke to silence. Vincent Delane, the greatest musician the city had ever known, was gone. His violin lay untouched on his chair. His footsteps had vanished. And yet, every night, when the moon was at its peak, a melody would drift through the streets. Haunting. Perfect. A song played by no one. And by the shadow that had once been a man. The countdown on the lonely island. Prologue: The wreck and the arrival. The storm had come without warning. One moment, the sea had been calm, a vast, rolling expanse of silver under the moonlight. The next, chaos. The ship was torn apart by waves taller than buildings. Wood splintered. Screams were swallowed by the roaring wind. The sky cracked open with lightning, and in the darkness, everything disappeared. When Adam Wells opened his eyes, he was lying on a beach, his body half buried in wet sand. The scent of salt and decay filled his lungs. His clothes were torn, his skin bruised. And he was alone. The wreckage of his ship was nowhere in sight. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, but the ocean was eerily still, too still. Then he saw it. Standing in the center of the island, surrounded by nothing but skeletal trees and jagged cliffs, was a massive stone monument. At first, he thought it was some kind of ancient ruin, weathered by time. But as he staggered toward it, his heart froze. Carved into its surface was a digital countdown. 72 hours. The numbers were glowing. And they were ticking down. Chapter 1: The Island That Wasn't Right. Adam had never believed in fate. But standing before the monolith, watching the numbers steadily decrease, he felt something ancient settle deep in his bones, something that whispered, "You were never supposed to be here." The island was wrong. The sky was too perfect, an unmoving canvas of deep indigo, as if it had been painted rather than real. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching in unnatural directions. The air was heavy, thick with a silence that felt like it was watching him. And then, there was the clock. 72 hours. 3 days. 3 days until what? Adam had no answers. But he knew one thing: he had to get off this island before the countdown hit 0. Chapter 2: The First Change. By the second day, the island had started changing. It wasn't obvious at first, just small, unsettling shifts. The position of the trees seemed different than the day before. The shoreline had moved slightly, creeping closer to the cliffs. And then, Adam made the mistake of looking at his own footprints in the sand. They were reversing. The prints he had left behind were fading, as if time itself was erasing his presence. His pulse pounded. He ran back to the stone monument. The countdown read 48 hours. Half the time was already gone. And the island was resetting itself. Chapter 3: The Creatures That Remembered. On the third day, the animals appeared. At first, he had seen nothing but barren land, no birds, no insects, not even the distant splash of fish in the water. But as the countdown neared its final stretch, things began to emerge from the jungle. They looked like animals, but they weren't. A deer with too many eyes, its gaze fixed on him as if it recognized him. A flock of birds that flew backward, their wings moving in reverse, their cries echoing before their beaks had opened. A shadow slithering between the trees, no body, no form, just the suggestion of something that had never been alive. They weren't hunting him. They were watching him. As if they were waiting for him to understand. Chapter 4: The Memories That Weren't His. The worst part wasn't the creatures. It was the memories. They started on the second night. Adam awoke to find himself sitting on the beach, even though he had gone to sleep inside a makeshift shelter. His hands were covered in blood, but there was no wound. And in his mind, there was a memory that did not belong to him. A memory of a woman standing before the monolith. Her face was blurred, but he could hear her voice, desperate, pleading. Please, don't let it happen again. Then, she vanished. And Adam was alone again. Chapter 5: The Truth of the Countdown. 24 hours left. By now, the island was barely holding itself together. The sky was flickering, as if struggling to maintain its form. The ocean no longer moved, it was frozen in place, as if time itself had forgotten it existed. The monolith's glow had intensified, casting long, unnatural shadows across the ground. And the numbers were lower than they should have been. They weren't counting in real time anymore. They were accelerating. Something was forcing the countdown to end sooner. Adam didn't know what would happen when it reached 0. But whatever it was, it had happened before. And if the memory of the woman was real, she had tried to stop it. Chapter 6: The Final Hour. By the last hour, the island was collapsing. Reality itself was unraveling. The jungle had vanished, replaced by a void of shifting shadows. The ocean had inverted, its surface reflecting the stars above rather than the sky. And the creatures, the Watchers, stood in a perfect circle around the monolith, their bodies now entirely wrong, their forms twisting between past and present, between what they were and what they had been before. Adam stood before the monument, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. He reached out, touched the stone surface. And everything stopped. Chapter 7: The Escape That Wasn't. Adam was no longer on the island. He was outside of time. The world around him was an endless void, filled with echoes of past countdowns. He saw flashes of others, other survivors, other people who had washed up here before him. None of them had escaped. And then, he saw her again. The woman from his memories. She stood before him, eyes hollow, her voice barely more than a whisper. The island isn't real. Adam's breath caught. What do you mean? It's a test. The monolith pulsed. It resets every time someone fails. And she hesitated. You were never the first. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The memories. The creatures. The changes. He had been here before. And the countdown. It wasn't leading to his destruction. It was leading to his return. Epilogue: The Next Survivor. Adam opened his eyes. The waves crashed gently against the shore. His body was half buried in the sand. The sky was too perfect. And in the center of the island, the monolith stood, waiting. The countdown glowed against its stone surface. 72 hours. And it was ticking down again. The man who got lost in a painting. Prologue: The Last Brushstroke. Elliot Faulkner had spent his entire life searching for perfection in his art. His paintings were admired by many, sought after by collectors, and whispered about in galleries as works that felt alive. Yet, to Elliot, none of them were ever enough. He wanted to create something beyond reality. Something that wasn't just seen, but entered. And one night, in the dim glow of his candlelit studio, he finished it. A landscape unlike anything that had ever existed, rolling emerald hills stretching toward an endless horizon, golden rivers reflecting a sky that was neither day nor night, and a single narrow path leading into the unknown. It was, he thought, his masterpiece. Then he went to sleep. And when he woke up, he was inside the painting. Chapter 1: The Painted World. Elliot gasped as he stumbled forward, his feet sinking slightly into soft, painted grass. The air smelled of oil and pigment, the sky above shifting in slow brushstrokes. Everything, the hills, the river, even the light, moved subtly, as if still drying on an unseen canvas. It was his world. His painting. But there was no canvas anymore. And no way out. He turned in circles, heart hammering. His studio was gone. His brushes, his easel, everything had disappeared. All that remained was the world he had created. And the longer he stood there, the more he realized something was wrong. Because his painting, his perfect painting, was changing. Chapter 2: The Brushstroke That Wasn't His. At first, it was subtle. A tree in the distance that hadn't been there before. A ripple in the golden river that didn't match his brushstrokes. Then, more. The grass grew taller, shifting in colors he had never used. Shadows stretched at odd angles, as if light had no true source. The path, which had once led into the horizon, now seemed to curve in a circle, leading him back to where he had started. And then, the most terrifying thing happened. He reached into his pocket and found a brush. The same one he had used to create this world. If this was still his painting, then maybe he could paint his way out. His hands trembled as he dipped the brush into the air, as if reaching for an invisible palette, and carefully, slowly, began to paint a door. A way back to reality. The moment it was finished, he exhaled in relief. Then, before his eyes, the door was erased. Not by wind. Not by accident. By something else. A force unseen, an invisible hand that dragged the paint away, leaving nothing but empty landscape where the exit had been. Something did not want him to leave. And worse, he was no longer alone. Chapter 3: The Figure in the Distance. At first, he thought it was just another mistake. A stray shadow where there shouldn't have been one. But then, as he walked, it moved. A figure. Far away, standing at the edge of the painted hills. Watching. Elliot's throat tightened. He had painted no one in this world. It had been empty, a landscape, nothing more. So who was that? He took a cautious step forward. The figure did not move. Then another step. Still, it stood there, featureless, its form shifting slightly with the painted air, as if unfinished. Elliot took a deep breath. And when he blinked, the figure was closer. Chapter 4: The Changing Canvas. Panic surged through him. The world was no longer his. The hills had grown jagged, the golden river now blackened with ink. The once clear sky cracked with streaks of unfamiliar brushstrokes, as if another artist was trying to repaint his masterpiece. And the figure. It was closer than before. No longer at the horizon. Now standing at the curve of the path. Waiting. Watching. Elliot clutched his brush. If this world could change, then he could fight back. He swept the bristles across the air, willing walls to rise, trees to block the figure's path. For a moment, it worked. The trees formed a dense barrier, shielding him. He exhaled, relief flooding his chest. Then, the trees peeled away. Erased. As if they had never existed. The figure stepped through the empty space, closer now. And Elliot ran. Chapter 5: The Artist and the Rival. He didn't stop until he reached the Golden River. Panting, he turned back. The figure was right there. No longer distant. Now standing just a few feet away. And for the first time, Elliot saw its face. His own. Or rather, a version of himself that was never completed. The figure's features were smudged, blurred as if left half painted. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth an unfinished sketch. But its hands were clear. One of them held a brush. And with slow, deliberate strokes, it reached forward and began to paint over Elliot himself. Chapter 6: The Unfinished Artist. The moment the brush touched him, Elliot's body changed. His fingers blurred, his legs smudged, his skin peeled away like wet paint. No. He stumbled back, gripping his own brush, trying to paint himself whole again. But the moment he did, the figure erased it. It was undoing him. Taking his place. Becoming the artist he had failed to be. And Elliot understood. This had happened before. Every artist who had sought perfection, who had tried to create a world greater than reality, they had all ended up here. Trapped in their own masterpieces. Replaced by the art itself. The figure reached out again. Elliot had one chance. One final stroke to change everything. With all his strength, he painted over himself. Erasing his name, his identity, his own existence from the canvas. And the figure froze. Because without a name, or without a painter, the painting had no creator. And without a creator, the world itself collapsed. Epilogue: The Empty Canvas. When Elliot opened his eyes, he was back in his studio. His brush lay beside him. His canvas stood before him. But the painting, his masterpiece, was blank. As if it had never existed. As if he had never painted it at all. And yet, as he turned away, his heart pounding, something caught his eye. A single unfinished brushstroke in the corner of the canvas. And a shadow standing at the edge of the painting. Watching. The dinner that never happened. Prologue: The Man Who Always Waited. Every Wednesday evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, the warm brass bell of La View's cafe would chime. And he would enter. An old man, impeccably dressed, always in a pressed charcoal grey coat with silver buttons, a dark vest underneath, and a pocket watch he never checked. His hair was neatly combed back, though streaked with the passage of years. His shoes, always polished. He never spoke much. Never greeted anyone. He simply walked to the same table, the one by the window, overlooking the cobbled Parisian street, and waited. He ordered 2 meals. One for himself. One for someone who never came. And then, as the hours passed, he would sit in absolute silence, watching the empty chair in front of him, his expression unreadable. By 9 o'clock, he would gently push his untouched plate aside, fold his napkin with care, leave a generous tip, and disappear into the night. Week after week. Month after month. Waiting for someone who never arrived. Until one Wednesday, he didn't come. And in his place, a letter was left on his table. Chapter 1: The Abandoned Ritual. Camille had worked at La View's cafe for nearly 6 years. And for 6 years, she had watched the old man wait. There was something ritualistic about it. Something intensely private. She had watched his fingers rest lightly against the rim of his wine glass. Watched his shoulders tense slightly whenever the bell over the door rang, only to relax again when it wasn't the person he was waiting for. She had always wanted to ask. But some silences were sacred. So when the clock struck 7 and the door did not open, she felt an uneasy stillness settle deep in her chest. At first, no one thought much of it. People broke routines all the time. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had forgotten. But then, the next Wednesday came. And the next. Still, he never returned. By the 3rd week, even Monsieur Dubois, the cafe's gruff but good-natured owner, looked concerned. Then one evening, As Camille was cleaning up after closing, she found it. The letter. It was in an envelope, placed neatly on his table, as if someone knew it would be found. And on the front, written in delicate, careful handwriting, was a single name. To Camille. Chapter 2: The Letter. The cafe was silent. The other waiters had gone home. The chairs had been stacked, the floor swept, the last of the candlelit sconces flickering. Camille stood in the empty cafe, holding the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. She shouldn't open it. She knew that. But some mysteries refused to be ignored. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Dear Mademoiselle Camille. By now, you must have noticed my absence. For many years, I have come to this cafe and ordered 2 meals. You must have wondered why. This letter is my answer. But be warned, Mademoiselle, there are truths in this world that once known, cannot be unknown. If you choose to read on, you must promise me one thing. That after you finish, you will never look for me. Camille's pulse quickened. A warning. A request. And yet, she turned the page. The person I have been waiting for is named Madeline. She was my wife. And on a Wednesday evening, 50 years ago, we had planned to meet here for dinner. She never arrived. Because she died that very night. Camille felt her breath catch in her throat. Madeline was not taken by illness, nor by accident. She was murdered. She clutched the letter. The ink on the page, once so elegant, now seemed darker. This wasn't a love story. It was something else. The police never found who did it. After years of searching, they declared it an unsolved case. A tragedy lost to time. But I could not forget. She had walked these streets. She had planned to meet me here. And so, I returned to this cafe. Every Wednesday. At the exact time she was supposed to arrive. Camille's hand shook. She turned the page. But that is not the real reason I am writing to you. I am writing because last month, after all these years, I finally saw her. Her breath caught. She was outside the cafe. She looked exactly as she had 50 years ago. And she was waiting. A chill ran down Camille's spine. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A cruel trick of age. But the next week, she was there again. And the week after that. Always standing across the street. Always watching. Camille's pulse pounded. Because she remembered now. A woman. Standing by the lamppost. She had noticed her in passing, always still, always silent, always watching. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Now, she wasn't so sure. I do not know what she is. I do not know if she has come for me, or if I have gone mad. But I cannot wait any longer. I am going to speak to her. If you are reading this letter, it means that I did not return. Please, Camille. Do not look for me. Chapter 3: The Woman by the Lamppost. Camille should have left it there. She should have listened. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. And that night, when her shift ended, she found herself walking toward the lamppost. The street was empty. The air was cold. And the moment she stepped into the glow of the streetlight, she saw her. A woman in an old-fashioned dress. Dark hair. Pale skin. Unmoving. Watching. Camille's stomach twisted. Her instinct screamed at her to turn away. But before she could, the woman tilted her head. And in a voice so soft it barely existed, she whispered, "Where is he?" Epilogue: The table for 2. The next Wednesday, the cafe's doorbell chimed. The waiters turned, half expecting the old man to have returned. But it wasn't him. It was Camille. She walked to his table, sat down, and ordered 2 meals. She did not eat. She only waited. And from across the street, beneath the glow of the lamppost, someone watched her. The farewell list at the airport. Prologue, the things we leave behind. Airports are filled with stories. Some are loud, tearful reunions, tight embraces, hurried goodbyes whispered at departure gates. Others are quiet, an unfinished book left on a seat, a forgotten scarf draped over a chair, the lingering scent of perfume in the waiting area. But the most intimate stories are the ones written on paper. Lists. Shopping lists, to-do lists, itineraries scribbled in haste, reminders that seemed important at the time but were left behind, lost in the rush of boarding calls and last-minute changes. No one paid attention to these scraps of paper, except for Luis Ortega, the night shift cleaner at Terminal C of the International Airport. For 12 years, he had been collecting them, the discarded remnants of other people's lives. Some were mundane: buy toothpaste, check passport, get coffee before flight. Others held hints of unfinished business: tell her the truth, don't forget the ring, call dad before it's too late. But every now and then, he found lists that weren't just plans. They were goodbyes. And one night, he found a list that changed everything. Because this time, it was his own handwriting. And it read, "Don't miss tomorrow's flight." Chapter 1: The Collector of Lists. Luis had never planned to work at the airport forever. 12 years ago, when he first took the job, it was meant to be temporary, just a way to get by until he figured things out. He had once dreamed of traveling, of seeing the places people rush to, of stepping onto flights instead of just cleaning around them. But life had a way of grounding people. Bills. Responsibilities. The comfort of routine. So instead, he swept the floors, emptied the bins, and watched thousands of people go where he never did. And, of course, he collected their lists. His tiny apartment was filled with them, hundreds of scraps of paper neatly stored in show boxes. Some he read over and over, wondering about the lives behind them. Who was the person who wrote, "Last chance to tell him I love him"? Did the one who scribbled, "Call mom before it's too late," ever make that call? He had one favorite. A small, wrinkled list that he had found near Gate 18 5 years ago. It read, "Things I won't regret." 1. Saying "I love you" even if he didn't say it back. 2. Missing my flight because my daughter wanted one more hug. 3. Letting go. Luis liked to believe that these lists mattered. That even if they were forgotten, they had shaped someone's life. But he never expected to find his own. Chapter 2: The List That Shouldn't Exist. It was nearly midnight when Luis found the note. He had been making his usual rounds, sweeping under the plastic chairs at Gate 26, when his fingers brushed a crumpled piece of paper. At first, he thought it was like any other, just another discarded scrap. But when he unfolded it, his breath caught. The handwriting was his. It wasn't possible. He never wrote lists. He had never lost one. But there it was. 1. Don't miss tomorrow's flight. Luis frowned. Tomorrow's flight? He wasn't going anywhere. He had never booked a ticket in his life. But there was something unsettling about the note. The ink looked fresh. The handwriting was rushed, almost urgent. It felt like a warning. And for the first time in 12 years, he felt a strange pull, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was supposed to go somewhere. Chapter 3: The Stories Left Behind. Luis spent the rest of his shift distracted, his mind tangled in the mystery of the note. Maybe someone had forged his handwriting. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But something in him whispered, "Pay attention." That night, he went home and did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his old passport. The pages were blank. Untouched. Unused. He exhaled slowly, running his fingers over the cover. Then he reached for one of his show boxes and pulled out an old list, one he had found years ago but never forgotten. It was written in careful, slanted handwriting. "Don't wait too long to live." Luis had found it at Gate 12, near the window where people watched planes take off. And suddenly, he realized something. He had spent years collecting goodbyes. But he had never given himself a chance to say hello to anything new. Chapter 4 of the final list. The next day, Lewis did something reckless. He bought a plane ticket. He didn't know where he was going yet. He just walked up to the counter, looked at the departure board, and chose the next available flight. To Lisbon. Why? He didn't know. Maybe because it sounded beautiful. Maybe because it was the farthest flight leaving that night. Maybe because some part of him had already decided to go, long before he found the note. He packed a small bag. He left his showboxes of lists behind. And for the first time in 12 years, he went through security not as an employee, but as a passenger. At the gate, he felt his pulse quicken. This was it. Then, just as he was about to board, he saw her. A woman standing near the window, staring at a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. Her shoulders shook. She looked like she was debating something, to leave or to stay. Lewis hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he walked over. "Are you okay?" She looked up, startled. She was holding a list. A single item was written on it. "Find the courage to go." Lewis smiled. "Me too." Epilogue: the things we carry. Airports are filled with stories. Some are loud. Some are quiet. And some are written on paper scraps that no one notices, except for those who need them most. Lewis never found out who wrote the note in his handwriting. Maybe it was him, from a different moment in time. Maybe it was just the universe's way of nudging him forward. Either way, he didn't miss his flight. And this time, he wasn't just collecting stories. He was finally living one. My neighbor is a rock. Prologue: the strangest thing on the balcony. I have always considered myself a rational person. I believe in things that make sense: science, logic, gravity. I do not believe in talking to inanimate objects. Which is why, on the very first morning in my new apartment, I was deeply unsettled when I stepped onto my balcony, stretched my arms toward the sun, and heard my next-door neighbor say, in a cheerful tone, "Good morning, Rocky." I turned, expecting to see a dog, a cat, maybe a pet tortoise. Instead, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patel, was talking to a rock. Not just any rock. A perfectly ordinary, slightly lumpy, grey stone, sitting on the shared balcony ledge between our apartments. And she wasn't alone. Moments later, a young woman from the apartment above leaned over her railing and threw a scarf onto the rock. "It's getting chilly, Rocky. Stay warm." Then, from below, someone shouted, "Morning, Rocky. Love you, buddy." I blinked. Had I moved into a building of lunatics? And more importantly, why were they all obsessed with a rock? Chapter 1: The Cult of the Rock. For the next week, I tried my best to ignore Rocky. It wasn't easy. Every morning, people greeted him. Every night, someone would tuck a tiny blanket around him, like he was an elderly relative who might catch a cold. I saw one guy polish him with a microfiber cloth. Another resident placed a tiny pair of sunglasses on him. And then, the truly bizarre part, the letters. At least once a week, someone would slip a neatly folded envelope underneath the rock. I tried not to stare. I tried to mind my own business. But after the 6th letter appeared, curiosity got the better of me. One evening, under the cover of darkness, I tiptoed onto my balcony, heart pounding like I was committing an international crime, and carefully lifted the rock. There, beneath the stone, was a yellowed envelope. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. And inside, I found a letter that changed everything. Chapter 2: The First Letter. The letter was written in elegant, slanted handwriting. It wasn't old, but it felt like something from another time, carefully penned, with no scribbles or mistakes. Dear Rocky, I hope you're doing well today. You're still here, aren't you? That means I still have time. I'll come back. I promise. Wait for me. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't some random joke. Someone, had written to this rock as if it were a real person. Worse, whoever they were, they expected a response. I stared at the letter, then at the rock, then at my bizarre new neighbors, who had spent weeks doting on this stupid lump of stone. And for the first time since moving in, I started to wonder if they knew something I didn't. Chapter 3: The Mystery of Rocky. The next morning, I casually approached Mrs. Patel while she was watering her balcony plants. Mrs. Patel, I said, trying to sound normal. About Rocky. She brightened. Oh. Isn't he wonderful? Sure, I said slowly. Just how long has he been here? Mrs. Patel tapped her chin. Oh, at least 20 years. Maybe longer. I nearly choked. 20 years? At least, she said cheerfully. He was here when I moved in, and I've been here for 15 years. The building was built around him. I stared. The building was what? Built around him, she repeated, as if this were perfectly normal. No one wanted to move him, so the architects just left him there. That was insane. But before I could say so, Mrs. Patel gave me a knowing smile. You found the letters, didn't you? I went stiff. What letters? Her smile widened. Ah, my dear. You're one of us now. Chapter 4: The History of a Rock. The legend of Rocky, as told to me by 5 different neighbors, was as follows. 1. He had been there before the building. Some said he was once part of a much larger boulder which had mysteriously cracked in half, leaving only this perfect chunk behind. 2. No one had ever successfully moved him. Several people had tried, construction workers, new tenants, even an overenthusiastic child with a toy dump truck. Rocky never budged. 3. People who wrote to him always got what they needed. Not what they'd wanted, but what they truly needed. 4. One person had promised to return. No one knew who Aid was. No one knew if they ever came back. And for 20 years, Rocky had waited. Chapter 5: The Second Letter. That night, I found another letter. It was shorter. Dear Rocky, I think I'm ready. Meet me at the train station. I blinked. A train station? I wasn't sure what came over me, but the next morning, I went. Chapter 6: The Station and the Truth. The old train station was almost deserted. For a long time, I saw nothing unusual. And then, an elderly man appeared on the platform, holding an identical letter to the one I had found. He looked around, scanning the crowd, his face filled with something I couldn't describe, hope, or maybe fear. And then, a woman, just as old, stepped off the arriving train. She saw him. She froze. Then, slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out something small. A rock. She held it up with trembling fingers, tears in her eyes. I told you I'd come back, she whispered. Epilogue: The last letter. The next morning, I stepped onto my balcony. Rocky was gone. Just gone. No one knew how. No one knew who had taken him. But Mrs. Patel just smiled and said, he waited long enough. That evening, I found one final letter. Dear friend. Thank you. It's finally time to go. And just like that, Rocky's story was over. Or maybe, just maybe, he had simply found a new place to wait. The Amnesia Cafe. Prologue: The cafe that took memories. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, where the streetlights flickered like fading memories, there was a cafe that didn't exist on maps. It had no official name. No advertisements. No menus. Only those who needed it found their way to its doors. And before they could sit down, before they could order a drink, they had to answer a single question. What do you wish to forget? There were no second chances. No guarantees. The cafe did not erase memory selectively, it simply took what it was given. Some people left lighter, free of burdens they had carried for years. Some left confused, grasping at the edges of memories they didn't know they had lost. And one day, a man walked in and forgot everything. Chapter 1: The Rules of Forgetting. It was raining the night Daniel Carter found the cafe. The neon signs from other buildings reflected in the puddles on the pavement, stretching and warping like memories distorted by time. His coat was damp, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he wandered the unfamiliar streets. He didn't remember why he was out so late. Did it matter? His life had become a cycle of work, sleepless nights, and a dull ache in his chest that never quite went away. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it, a small wooden sign hanging above a black painted door, flickering under a dim lantern. The Amnesia Cafe. He didn't hesitate. The door creaked open, a warm scent of coffee and something unplaceable wrapping around him like a forgotten embrace. The cafe was small, lit by golden lamps that cast elongated shadows. A single barista stood behind the counter, an older man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence. Daniel barely had time to take in his surroundings before the barista spoke. "What do you wish to forget?" The question settled in the air between them. Daniel hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to forget. A love that had ended badly. A mistake that had cost him a friend. The emptiness that gnawed at him whenever he lay awake at night. But how could he choose just one? "Anything," he said at last. "Just take whatever's weighing me down." The barista's expression didn't change. "Understood." He poured a cup of something dark, something richer than coffee, something that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Daniel drank. And the world went black. Chapter 2: A Man Without a Past. He woke up in the same chair. The cafe looked exactly as it had before. The rain still pattered against the windows. The golden light still flickered. But something was wrong. He blinked, trying to remember where he was. Who he was. Nothing came. His heart pounded. What did you do to me?" The barista's voice was calm. "You asked to forget." Daniel's breath hitched. Not a single memory surfaced in his mind. No name. No family. No history. Nothing. "Who am I?" The barista didn't answer. Because the cafe did not return what it took. And Daniel Carter had just erased himself. Chapter 3: A City That Didn't Remember. Panic clawed at his throat as he stumbled out of the cafe, into the rain. The street was unfamiliar. His hands shook as he reached into his pockets, hoping for some proof of his existence. A wallet. A key. A phone. The phone's lock screen displayed a number he didn't recognize. The ID inside his wallet bore a name, Daniel Carter, but the face looking back at him felt like a stranger's. How had he ended up here? He needed help. He needed... Who? His mind was empty. It wasn't just his name that was gone. It was everything. And worse, no one recognized him. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Man. He returned to his apartment, guided only by the address in his wallet. It was small, clean, but devoid of any personality. No photographs. No personal touches. Had he always lived like this? A single framed quote hung on the wall. "Some things are meant to be forgotten." Had he written that? He sat on the couch, head in his hands. The phone in his pocket vibrated. A message. "Unknown number. Are you okay?" His fingers hovered over the screen. He hesitated, then replied. "Who are you?" A long pause. Then, "Unknown number, you don't remember me, do you?" Chapter 5: The Memory Hunter. Over the next few days, Daniel retraced his life like a detective investigating a missing person. Only the missing person was himself. He visited his workplace. His co-workers greeted him politely but didn't seem particularly close to him. He went to his usual bar. The bartender barely glanced up when he ordered a drink. He had existed, but he had not lived. No deep friendships. No passionate loves. Nothing worth remembering. Had that been his wish all along? Then, one evening, he found another message on his phone. Unknown number, meet me at the cafe. I can help you remember. Chapter 6, The Choice to Remember. He returned to the Amnesia Cafe. The barista was waiting. So was a woman. She had kind eyes, but when she looked at him, there was sadness there. Daniel, she whispered. He flinched. The name felt foreign. You don't know me, she said. But I know you. She slid a letter across the table. Handwriting identical to his own. If I forget everything, remind me of this. I asked for this. I was tired of my life, of being invisible. But if you're reading this, maybe I made a mistake. Tell me, who was I happy? His breath hitched. The woman hesitated. You weren't unhappy. But you weren't living either. You were just going through the motions. He swallowed hard. And you? Who are you? She bit her lip. A friend. Maybe something more, once. Silence. Finally, she asked, do you want to remember? Daniel stared at the letter. At the cafe that had stolen his past. At the woman who still cared, even when he did not. And for the first time since losing himself, he made a choice. Yes. Epilogue, the cafe that waits. The Amnesia Cafe never closed. It never advertised. It never changed. People still wandered in, looking for release from their burdens. Some left lighter. Some left empty. And some, like Daniel Carter, left ready to remember again. The last bus home. Prologue, the bus that never stopped. The city was always quiet at midnight. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that made the streets seem hollow, as if the world had forgotten this place existed. And somewhere, deep in that forgotten hour, a bus always appeared. It had no set schedule, no official route, no number on its front. But if you were lost, if you had nowhere else to go, it would find you. And once you stepped on, the door would close. And it would never let you off. Chapter 1, The Final Ride. Daniel Blake was exhausted. It had been a miserable day. A long shift at a dead-end job, a broken umbrella, and an argument with his sister that still rang in his ears. He had missed the last scheduled bus home. Typical. Now he was walking, cold, wet, and tired. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. Then, just as he turned a corner, he saw it. A bus, waiting at an unmarked stop. The headlights cut through the fog. The doors were open. Daniel hesitated. Where had it come from? There was no scheduled service this late. But he was too tired to think. He stepped on. The doors hissed shut behind him. And the bus began to move. Chapter 2, The Passengers. There were only a few people inside. A man in a suit, tapping his fingers nervously against his briefcase. A woman with a faded scarf, staring blankly out the window. An old man in a worn coat, holding a crumpled letter in his lap. No one looked up. No one acknowledged his presence. Daniel took a seat near the middle, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The bus was strangely cold, despite the heater humming faintly. He glanced out the window. The city passed by in a blur, the streetlights flickering like dying stars. Something felt off. He leaned over to check the bus number, but there wasn't one. The screen above the driver's seat displayed only 2 words. Final destination. A chill crawled up his spine. Chapter 3, The Driver Who Never Spoke. The driver never turned his head. He was a large figure, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, his cap pulled low over his eyes. His hands, impossibly still, gripped the wheel. Not once did he check the road. Not once did he acknowledge the passengers. And the bus kept moving. Faster. Daniel swallowed. "Excuse me." The driver did not react. He tried again. "Where is this bus going?" Silence. Daniel turned to the other passengers. No one spoke. No one moved. Something was wrong. And then, the man in the suit turned his head, just slightly. "You shouldn't have gotten on." Chapter 4: The Stops That Never Came. Daniel's heart pounded. He gripped the edge of his seat. "Why?" he asked. The man in the suit exhaled shakily. "This bus doesn't stop." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I need to get off at." The woman with the scarf suddenly turned. "You can't." Her voice was empty, like she had already accepted something he hadn't. Daniel glanced toward the driver again. Still motionless. Still driving. "But..." The old man in the worn coat spoke next. His voice was hoarse. "Tired. You only get off when you're ready." Daniel stared at them. "Ready for what?" No one answered. The bus kept moving. Chapter 5: The Places That Weren't Real. Something was happening outside. Daniel pressed his forehead to the cold glass. The city was gone. There were no buildings anymore. No streets. Just an endless road, stretching forward into a void of shifting colors. It was not night, but it was not day. It was nowhere. And the bus was still going. Daniel's breath hitched. "What is this place?" The man in the suit clenched his jaw. "It's different for everyone." The woman whispered, "It's where you face what you left behind." Daniel turned to them. The man held his briefcase tightly, as if afraid to let go. The woman's scarf looked worn, almost translucent, like something that should have been discarded long ago. The old man was gripping his letter, his fingers shaking. Each of them had brought something unfinished onto this bus. And suddenly, Daniel knew. So had he. Chapter 6: The Farewells That Were Never Said. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around something. A note. When had he written this? His eye skimmed the words. "I'm sorry. I never meant to leave things the way they were." A lump formed in his throat. Suddenly, memories came rushing back. The phone call he never answered. The argument with his sister. The things he had left unsaid. This was why he was here. Because some part of him had been searching for closure. And the bus had found him. Chapter 7: The Doors That Only Opened Once. He looked up. The old man was staring at his letter, his lips moving silently. Then, a soft chime rang through the bus. The doors opened. Outside, there was nothing, just a vast, open road, stretching forever. The old man stood. For the first time, he smiled. He folded the letter carefully, placed it on his seat, and stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind him. And he was gone. Chapter 8: The Last Stop. One by one, the passengers left. The woman with the scarf disappeared into the fog. The man with the briefcase hesitated, then finally stepped forward, letting go of whatever had been keeping him here. And then, it was just Daniel. Alone. The driver finally spoke. "Are you ready?" Daniel swallowed hard. He thought of his sister. Of everything he had avoided saying. Of the life still waiting for him. And he stood up. The doors opened one last time. And Daniel stepped into the light. Epilogue: The bus that kept moving. The bus never stopped for long. It always found new passengers, those with unfinished business, those who needed one last chance to say goodbye. And somewhere, deep in the forgotten hours of the night, when the city was quiet, it would find someone else. The Expired Wish. Prologue: The Letter in the Clearance Bin. The Crestview department store had been around for decades. Once, it was the heart of the town, a grand place filled with marble floors, chandeliers, and glass display cases that sparkled under soft golden lighting. Now, it was closing down. The store had long since lost its magic. The escalators creaked, the carpets were stained, and the mannequin stood awkwardly, dressed in outdated clothes. Most of the employees had already been laid off, and the few who remained were there to help clear out the last of the inventory. That was when they found it. The letter. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, wedged between the pages of an old account ledger. The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed but slightly bent at the edges. The handwriting on the front was childlike, written in blue crayon. "Please grant my wish." Inside, there was a single wish coupon, one of those novelty slips the store had given away to customers decades ago. But there was no name. And no wish written down. Just a blank space where someone had once meant to write their dream, but never did. The employees stared at the letter. And one of them, a woman named Maggie, made a decision. Let's find out who wrote this. And so began the search for a wish left behind for 20 years. Chapter 1: The Wish That Never Was. Maggie was the kind of person who believed in stories. She wasn't a dreamer, exactly, she was practical, good at her job, and known for being level-headed. But she also knew that some things, once found, couldn't just be ignored. And the letter, this forgotten wish, felt like one of those things. She showed it to the remaining staff. Joe, the grumpy but good-hearted security guard who had been with the store the longest. Hannah, the youngest employee, who had been working part-time since high school. Mr. Thompson, the store manager, who sighed and said it wasn't their job to track down 20-year-old mysteries. But even he was curious. "It's probably from a kid," Hannah said. "Maybe they forgot to write their wish," Joe added. "Or maybe they changed their mind," Maggie said. No one knew. And that was the most intriguing part. Chapter 2: The First Clue. The first thing they did was check old store records. Crestview had given out wish coupons as part of a promotional event 20 years ago. Customers could write a wish on the coupon, and one lucky winner would have their wish granted. Some had asked for toys. Some for money. One kid had even asked for a dog made of gold. He didn't win. But this wish was left blank. And the letter had been hidden, as if someone had written it but never turned it in. Maybe they were too shy to submit it, Hannah suggested. Or maybe they thought it wouldn't come true, Joe muttered. Maggie ran her fingers over the paper, as if trying to feel the past through it. If they never got their wish, maybe they still need it. And that was how they ended up tracking down a 20-year-old forgotten dream. Chapter 3: The Search Begins. Their first stop was the printing company that had made the coupons. The old owner, Mr. Patel, still remembered them. "Oh, those wish slips? Yeah, we printed thousands of them. Kids loved them." Maggie handed him the letter. "Do you remember if there was a winner that year?" Mr. Patel scratched his chin. "I think it was some kid who wanted to meet Santa Claus. The store brought in a guy in a fancy red suit, made a big deal about it. That didn't help." "What about the ones who didn't win?" Mr. Patel shook his head. "That's the thing about wishes, miss. You don't always find out what happens to them." But then he paused. "Wait. I do remember something odd. There was one wish that never got turned in." Maggie's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "One of the kids took the slip, but they never wrote anything down. They just held on to it. Looked real nervous about it, too." "Do you remember their name?" "Now. But I remember they had this old backpack with a rabbit keychain." A rabbit keychain. It wasn't much. But it was a start. Chapter 4: The Past That Stayed Behind. For the next week, Maggie and her small team followed the clues. They asked old customers. They searched through archived photos. They even checked local school records, trying to find any child from that time who might have had a rabbit keychain. And then they found her. Her name was Elena Rivera. She had been 8 years old when the wish event happened. And she had been at the store that day. But here was the strange part. Elena had disappeared from town shortly after. No one knew why. And no one knew where she had gone. Chapter 5: The Girl Who Left Without a Wish. Through an old address record, they tracked Elena's last known location to a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Joe and Hannah knocked on the door. A woman in her 30s opened it. She had soft eyes, but there was something tired in them, like she had spent too many years carrying something heavy. "Can I help you?" Maggie took a deep breath. "Did you, by any chance, once own a rabbit keychain?" Elena went completely still. A long silence. Then, she stepped aside. "Come in." Chapter 6: The Wish That Was Never Made. They sat in Elena's small living room, surrounded by old books and faded pictures. And finally, she told them the truth. "I remember the wish coupon," she said softly. "I remember holding onto it for hours, trying to think of what to write. And I couldn't." Her voice wavered. "Because at the time, my only wish was for my dad to come home." The room went silent. But he never did. She had never turned in the wish slip. Because she had been too afraid it wouldn't work. And the next day, she and her mother had left town, without ever looking back. Chapter 7: The Wish That Came True After All. Maggie, Hannah, and Joe sat with Elena for a long time. They shared stories, laughed over old memories. And in the end, Elena smiled. "I think I'm okay now." She no longer needed the wish. She had built a good life, even without it. And maybe that was the real magic of it. Sometimes, wishes don't come true the way we expect, but we end up okay anyway. And when Maggie and the others left that night, the last thing Elena did was frame the old wish slip, not as a regret, but as a reminder that some things are worth hoping for, even after 20 years.